We are excited to introduce the next panel moderator, Dorian Warren, the co-president of Community Change. Dorian is joined by Tara Raghuveer, Paul Williams, and Jamila Headley. Please give our panel a warm welcome.
So thanks, everybody. I do want to start by offering another just appreciation and a quick moment of silence for Dr. Bill Spriggs, who was a mentor, advocate, movement leader, served in government, served outside of government for so many of us. So can we just take maybe 15 seconds to honor him? Thank you. Let me start with two quick observations, panel. And I am going to forgo long introductions of this amazing, dope set of panelists because you can Google them and see how amazing they are. And I also have to pick up my child from childcare. So we're going to do, this is going to be like speed round. So I didn't start late. Anyway. So, Amaya, I just want to say I appreciate you. I wish you were my former alderperson. You mentioned Inglewood in Chicago, and that's where my nephew actually goes to grade school. And that Whole Foods you mentioned is where my sister-in-law used to work, where she actually contracted COVID in March of 2020 because she was an essential worker. And this is before the state and the governor intervened, and the mayor, to offer protection. So a form of public power that she wasn't at the time subject to yet. And then we heard from the amazing Lieutenant Governor Flanagan. Please give her another round of applause. Like, if you don't know what just went down in Minnesota, you need to actually Google that and read some articles, because that legislative session was incredible for so many different issues. And as she said, and I want to emphasize, the use of that state-level public power was a decade of organizing to get to that point, a decade of organizing. So as we tell the story, it's important to tell the story of the outside infrastructure that is useful and necessary for when elected champions are using public power. So with that, and that's what we're going to talk about, public power at the local level, at the state level, and yes, at the federal level, since we're here in DC. And Jamila, I'm going to start with you and then ask Tara and Paul to jump in. But I do want you to just start by explaining what we mean by public power. Like, what does that mean for each of you? How would you explain it, I don't know, to an 11-year-old or to a grandparent? Like, what's your common understanding of public power and why it's so important?
Well, I'd love to start with asking everybody else here some questions about public power. Anyone who got a COVID test from the government in the last few years, can I see a show of hands? That's awesome. Does anyone have anyone that they love or anyone in the room who's on Medicare? Anyone visited any national parks recently or any public parks in their neighborhoods? Anyone been to the library recently? Okay, that's public power. That's the power of harnessing all of our taxpayer dollars, all of our investment and trust in government to actually deliver things that are meaningful in our lives. So I'm gonna end it there.
I'm a tenant organizer, and I will never shut up about tenant organizing, so I'm gonna define it in the way that I do when I'm talking to people in my tenant union. The tenant union is what I think of when I think of public power. It's a collective of people who are stronger together than they are as individuals, but it's not just a story about power in numbers. It's people power that is wielded to achieve something that those people couldn't achieve as individuals. And then when I think about public power and the role of the government, especially on my issue on housing, the role of the government is profound, because the forces of capital that the people are up against make it so that we're always moving. You can't build a tenant union if you're always moving. That latent power that we have as a collective is so threatened by a market that's unchecked. And the check has to come from the government, and that's the beginning of a different form of public power where the government actually delivers for those collectives of people who are organizing with their neighbors.
I think there's another piece of public power that I focus a lot on, which is capacity within the public sector to actually do these kinds of activities that we want them to do. There was a time in United States history where state agencies, local governments, and the federal government made a ton of huge investments in really complicated infrastructure, a lot of projects in the era of the New Deal, but also through the 50s and 60s. And then for decades, there was this kind of hollowing out of that capacity as all of these activities were kind of outsourced to the private sector to take care of all of this kind of development activity that we actually want the public sector to do. And so a piece of public power, in my mind, is how do we rebuild that capacity within the public sector so that we can deliver the kind of economic development we want ourselves?
So let me pick up on that, to deliver the kind of economic development, or to deliver public goods, the provision of public goods, or public option even. So I'm gonna ask each of you a question about, to really talk about the use of public power in terms of your own expertise. So Jamila, I'm gonna come to you first to talk about healthcare. Tara, obviously I'm gonna ask you about housing justice, and Paul about decarbonization. So Jamila, talk to us about why we need a public option. What is a public option in healthcare, for those of you that might have forgotten? And why do we need a public option in healthcare? What is needed, and what does the movement organizing look like today relative to, say, 2009 around healthcare?
So first on why we need a public option, or I would say public provision, public power for healthcare. I mean, where do we start, right? We live in a country where 1 in 5 people have medical debt. 1 in 5 households have medical debt. We live in a country where 1 in 10 people are literally cutting up pills or skipping doses because they can't afford the medicines that they need. We live in a place where millions of people are still uninsured. We live in a country that even with passing the Affordable Care Act, which fell short of the public option that many of us wanted, right? 1 in 5 of all claims of people on marketplace plans are being denied right now by insurance companies. All of this while we spend almost twice as much as any other country, including the richest countries in the other richest countries in the world, on healthcare. That's why we need a public option in healthcare, because the market is clearly failing to deliver anything that is rational, that makes sense, that makes economic sense, or makes sense in terms of our healthcare and what people need for this country. And it doesn't matter where you are, it doesn't matter how good your insurance is. If you've spent hours on the phone with your health insurance company, you know that we need a public option. We need something different. It's not working for us. So that's really clearly, for me in healthcare, the need for a public option is perhaps most acute and most clear. I mean, it's clear so in housing, given the size of the industry. And all of this while the industry is about 18% of our economy and continues to be incredibly profitable. I don't know if people saw recently, United Healthcare Group is now the 6th largest company in America, right? So this is why we need a public option. And I think, what has happened since 2009, we were on a trajectory to build towards, and we had this incredible moment of opportunity, which we did use. We used to advance access to healthcare for so many people. The Affordable Care Act has totally transformed the reality. I wouldn't be in this country right now without the Affordable Care Act. I was uninsured when I fell incredibly ill here in the United States, and experienced thinking I would never be able to be insured again in this country were it not for the Affordable Care Act. I wouldn't be here either, and the same is true for millions of people. There was a huge amount of resources invested in making that fight possible that have since dwindled. So I think that the force for healthcare reform and for continued progressive realization of public provision of healthcare is weaker than it was in 2009. And I think that's a shame, because I think we have real threats and real opportunities.
Can I ask you quickly as a follow-up just to talk about 2 bright spots potentially? So the state of California has intervened in the healthcare system in a particular way. President Biden intervened also in terms of trying to cap the price of drugs, particularly insulin. Can you just talk about those two examples of public intervention, public power? And I take your point that the organizing has dissipated a bit, and so we need to actually rebuild that movement.
And actually, this speaks to the power of the issue. Even with relatively kind of lean organizing, because healthcare is so powerful in the consciousness of so many people in America, it has become an issue where we have been able to make steady gains despite the odds. So even when the Republicans came for the Affordable Care Act, we were able to save that despite the odds. In the midst of a pandemic, we were able to advance massive things in public provision. We all got free COVID tests. We all got vaccines provided by the government. Our healthcare workers got PPE that the government produced and accelerated the production of so that we could be kept safe in hospitals. So we've seen actually the last few years have been remarkable in terms of public provision, in part because of the pandemic. And we've seen a lot of those major shifts because of the pandemic. But some of them have happened, were on their way to happening even before the pandemic and happened sort of despite it. The insulin pricing is one of them. Drug companies completely price gouging an old drug, overplaying their hand in many ways, right? Like so powerful that they're overplaying their hand in a way that does not track with public consciousness at all, right? And what we've seen is a real outcry against the price of insulin that has driven reform through Biden's intervention and through the Democrats' intervention in drug pricing negotiation for Medicare and Medicaid. And then now in California, through Governor Newsom's announcement that he will, the state of California will partner with a nonprofit drug production company to produce insulin at $30 per vial in that state, which is hugely remarkable. In each case, though, it is important to note that they have done this while coming under severe attack by corporations. And so I think really key to talking about public power is also talking about what we do about corporate power and how we actually begin to make sure that we are not fighting more and more powerful corporations in the future. So how we deal with things like corporate consolidation, how we deal with things with like regulating and cracking down on evergreening in drug pricing where they can continually increase the price of medicines even though patents have expired, et cetera.
Y'all could give it up for Jamila, please. Especially on the corporate power note. Tara, this is going to get me in trouble with my own staff, but you're the most badass housing justice organizer in the country. And so I want to ask you to say all the things on what it would take to create safe, secure, affordable housing using the power of government in the state. And if you could also talk a little bit about what happens when the issue of housing justice is on the ballot. As we just learned in the midterms last year, it is not just the right thing to do, it's actually a winning issue. So talk to us about the vision for public provision of safe, secure, affordable housing for housing justice, and what happens when we electoralize those things. And of course, this is, we're not endorsing any candidates or anything in this conversation. We're keeping it totally C3.
Never. I have to start in a similar place to Jamila, which is that our housing system is a catastrophic failure, period, full stop. It is a catastrophic failure that in this country, people are making choices between their prescriptions and their rent. It is a story of market failure that hundreds of thousands of people sleep on the streets in the world's richest country. It is a story of market failure that after a pandemic where landlords got bailed out with no strings attached, hundreds of billions of dollars from the federal government, tenants got evicted at the end of that, and their rents got hiked by over 20% in most regions across this country. That is a story of market failure, right? And when we talk about public power and the things that we need from our government to protect us, the industry's panties get in a bunch, and they say, everything you're proposing is gonna change the market. And we say, that's our fucking point. You can. That's the point. The market is not working for anyone except a very small handful of profiteers who are actually the architects of the market that they enjoy. And for everyone else, it is that catastrophic failure. It is painful every day. People are dying. I see people's health deteriorate in Kansas City the minute, the month after they get evicted out of their home, right? People are dying, and it's in some ways less acute than some of the health emergencies and stuff, right? So it's maybe easier to ignore, and housing's been ignored for so long. It's been this unsexy, unpolitical issue. It's not been talked about as an economic policy issue, and that the time is changing, actually, because I think the scale and breadth of the crisis is so severe. So you're right, Dorian, housing has become a political issue on the ballot. It's a winning issue on the ballot. Rent stabilization policies are passing across the country. Affordable housing, truly affordable housing funds are starting across the country. We just won $50 million for affordable housing in Kansas City on the ballot in November. Folks in Minnesota, in some of the cities in Minnesota, are passing rent stabilization policies. So it's a winning issue, and that's because people are becoming politicized about this crisis that they face. The rent is the biggest bill. The rent is the biggest bill that most Americans pay every month. And until very recently, it's been all but ignored as a political issue. And luckily, that's changing. And of course, that's not even saying anything about the amazing tenant organizing that's starting to happen across this country. And if I have anything to do with it, it will only continue to grow and become more potent and less ignorable. So the thing that we're looking for in public power around this issue, we want the government to take a much bigger role in creating housing, in creating social housing that's off of the market, that's not available for speculation, that's publicly backed, where tenants are protected into perpetuity, right? So there's the creation side. There's also the side where the government has to take seriously its role to regulate the market that we have today. And to talk about that, we actually have to talk about the role that the government is playing today, which is an enabling role. One of the biggest roles that the government plays today is through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government-sponsored enterprises that undergird so much of the market that has run away from us. And instead of regulating the big private equity landlords that get their financing through the GSEs, the government is actually enabling their business practice that relies on regular and aggressive rent hikes. So what we want is for the government to say every dollar of public financing, of federally backed financing and subsidy, any tax credit program, any grant from HUD, comes with strings attached. If you get money from the government, you're on the hook to make sure your tenants are protected. So that's another really critical piece. And at the local level, I think there's a lot more that governors, that mayors can start to do to protect tenants, passing Tenants' Bill of Rights, encouraging and supporting a tenant's right to organize in a union being among some of the most important.
Thank you, Tara. Give it up for Tara, please. Paul, I want you to nerd out with us on all things electricity grid, public utilities. If there's a day, if you needed a reminder on the need to decarbonize our economy, just look outside. Just try to breathe the air. If you're on the East Coast, and particularly in the South. So, Paul, talk to us about what, in particular, the Inflation Reduction Act has opened up in terms of the possibilities of public power when we know the market has failed. In fact, it wasn't designed to solve this problem of decarbonizing our economy and our electricity grid. So talk to us about your vision for the use of public power to provide to provide clean energy, and what's the role of public utilities?
Yeah, so the Inflation Reduction Act, the kind of big ticket item that is going to help with decarbonizing the electrical grid is the clean energy tax credits. And it's this whole set of different programs where you get a tax credit if you make an investment that qualifies, right? You build some solar panels, you get a tax credit. The issue with these existing for the past decade is that there are a lot of entities that don't pay taxes, and therefore tax credits are useless to them, right? The New York Power Authority doesn't pay taxes to the IRS. That wouldn't make sense. The city of Atlanta doesn't pay taxes to the IRS. So they're ineligible to claim the value of these credits and make their own investments in publicly owned solar panels or wind turbines or anything like that. The Inflation Reduction Act completely changed that. So now all of those kind of tax-exempt entities, public sector entities, cities, state power agencies, public utility districts, they're all eligible. So when they make these investments, they'll get a grant from the federal government that pays for a huge portion of that project. And the way I like to think about the possibility that this opens up is for the past while we've had these programs that, we have one set of actors, the private sector over here, and they're doing their thing. We have tax credits available to them. And we've had this whole kind of pen of actors who we've said, you're not allowed to play. You're not allowed, we're not gonna pay you to build solar panels. Now we've opened that door, and we have all of these actors who actually can do this for us now. So on that level, it's about speeding up decarbonization. We have a whole new set of actors, a whole new set of capital, the municipal bond market, all this money and actors that can jump into this, and that's great. The other piece is that public sector actors have a lot more social goals that they want to and are able to pursue when they're making those investments that a private sector actor may not necessarily want to do. And that includes things like how electricity rates are set, that includes where investments are made, that includes how well the jobs pay, whether they're union jobs, and the public sector is going to be more interested in doing all of those things, and it's going to be able to be pushed democratically to do those things and make those investments in the way that we want it to. So I think this is a huge opportunity for organizing to get the public sector to make these kinds of investments over the next decade while these programs exist. And I think we kind of have an opportunity for a renaissance of public power this decade.
So I want to pick up on what you just said in terms of social issues and ask the three of you the question about racial justice and racial equity. Because while the assumption for us here is that public power is a good thing, we should all be for public power and increase public power, a whole bunch of us have been on the losing side of state power and public power. So I'm channeling Heather McGee's book in the closing, right, of swimming pools as public goods to keep black people out. So talk to us about, and I'll come back down to you, Jamila, and we can go this way again. How do we learn lessons from the past in terms of racial exclusion, of gender discrimination? How do we ensure, as we're making a case for the use of public power around a range of things, healthcare, housing, energy, banks, how do we make sure we are centering racial justice in particular and not replicating what we've done since the history of this country?
Yeah, such an important question, Dorian. And I think it really matters what our movements, what our ecosystems that are pushing for these changes look like, who they are, who they center. For me, centering the people most harmed by this healthcare system, which are disproportionately black people and other people of color, indigenous people, disabled people, centering them in both the solutions and the movement that demands the change is part of how we get to public power for public good and for our good, our collective good. But it feels very critical, and there are all sorts of ways that we can see over time public power misused. And so I think it's really important that we build the movements and work on the policy solutions that are really driven by people who are closest to the hardship and the pain of these issues.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think on housing, it's so clear the ways that the government has played a role in actively disenfranchising some and enfranchising others. Housing is the infrastructure of American racial capitalism. And what I mean by that is that the government has regularly, through our history, intervened to enrich white homeowners, landowners. The property laws that our governments are still following today in some way or another were written by white landowning, slave-owning men. and we're still dealing with the remnants of their architecture, of our system. And the tenants that we organize have every reason, because of that history, to distrust the role of the government. And we have to actually recognize that. And so I think the answer is in organizing. Most of my answers end with organizing. But it's like when I'm knocking on someone's door and the government is actually the pain point, right? And this happened. A couple summers ago, I was organizing a trailer park where the county had told everyone, you gotta go, because we're gonna build a jail. Get out of your home of 40 years. You lose all your equity in your mobile home. We're building a jail on this land, right? So I knock on those doors, and I don't have a great story to tell about the role of the government, because everyone there is rightfully pissed about the role of the government. I do have a story to tell about what's possible when those neighbors get together and what we can get out of the government. So sometimes you just gotta meet people where they're at. They don't have to like the government to recognize there's something that we can come together around to get from the government. And in those wins, they start to see the potential of public power, even if they don't believe it initially, right? But getting the material win is so critical, because our people have not materially benefited from many changes from the government. In fact, they've materially lost a lot from government intervention in the past, and they see it happen to themselves and their loved ones all the time. So I think organizing to get people clear on what the government could do without necessarily telling them a rosy story about how great the government is critical. And then the other thing I will say that's critical to racial justice in our campaigning and in our victories is organizing in a way that takes seriously people's fear and their pain, and organizing in a way that connects people across lines of difference. In a tenant union, if you're not regularly fighting, like if you're not fighting each other every day on big and small things, you're not organizing a tenant union, right? It's hard. It's like hard work every day. And not all of that, but a lot of it comes down to things like race, right? But duking that stuff out in the context of our union is critical, so that when it comes to designing policy, proposing campaigns, talking to decision makers, we are genuinely bringing them something that's coming from a collective that's worked through tough stuff. And we're not giving them the easy way out by saying, well, you can ignore those people or don't worry about this piece. We're also not talking in platitudes. It's like real shit that we've cooked through trial and error.
You know, I think one thing that's shifted about what the government is asking for, particularly with the IRA and with this kind of shift toward industrial policy for a lot of climate and energy related things, is that a lot of these programs that exist for decarbonization have a lot of requirements of the business community that the business community doesn't particularly like, such as, if you want all of these extra benefits, you need to hire union labor. And you get extra benefits if you do this project in a low-income community or in an energy-impacted community. And the rules around how those benefits work have, created some anger in the business community, because they don't want to be required to do things that they don't want to do. And so I think this is a positive change that we've seen with like some of these programs, is that the government can actually regulate the market and tell the business community that, like, no, we're going to make you do these things the way that we want you to do them, in a way that benefits impacted communities that have been underinvested for a long time and been subject to low-wage jobs in the past, and now there's this pressure to push that in the opposite direction.
So I want to bring a couple threads together, and then I will open up for questions. We're going to do a really fast speed round. Because if I get fined for being late, I'm just going to pass it on to whoever talks the longest. So just heads up on that. Okay, so I want to bring Bill Spriggs, Dr. Spriggs, back in the room for just one quick minute, and encourage you to search and find his open letter to Economist upon the murder of George Floyd. And I raise that because that is, again, the dark side of public power that we got to be honest about and talk about. But it was an entire just brutal critique of the economics profession, and there's a lot of work out there now. And the use of the economics profession and how they talk about race and how they have propped up neoliberalism. It has propped up neoliberalism for decades. Point one. Point two is we heard from the Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota about all the amazing wins. And so this is really a question about defense, because those are like offensive wins. And then we also heard earlier from Representative Ramirez, from my hometown, and she really raised the issue of work requirements. And that's important, right? Because for those of us that were in the debt ceiling fight in this town, it was infuriating. But I want to remind people that the original goal of the right was to put work requirements in Medicaid, that was a fight. And basically, they had to threaten to crash the global economy to push what is a zombie idea, a racist, sexist zombie idea of work requirements, to which a friend said to me, well, Dorian, all zombie ideas have fiscal sponsors. So, this is by way of a question, we have a lot of defensive battles, either of zombie ideas or of where we've made gains in terms of public power and public goods. How do we think about, I'm going to start with you this time, Paul, and go this way. How do we think about defense as we're doing offensive campaigns here? How do you actually hold on to the wins and ensure that they're not undermined? There is always backlash and retrenchment. So really, like, how should we be thinking about defense for the things that we have won while we're trying to play offense at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, I think one that we saw a kind of small loss recently was the IRS, some of the IRS funding getting taken away in the past couple of weeks. And I think it's going to be really important to continue to play defense on that funding, because that funding, there's more funding that's still there, and it's to be spent over a period of years, and it's going to be really important to defend all of that, because there's a lot that we're asking the IRS to do over the next decade. The vast majority of our climate program, our decarbonization program in the IRA, that's run by the IRS. They're all tax credits that the IRS is then going to have to process. We need them to be able to expand operations to do that kind of work. Another thing that we're asking the IRS to do is create a way for us to pay our taxes on their website. Directly file our taxes instead of having TurboTax have a site where then they file it and send it to the IRS for you and then charge you some money for doing it. The IRS could actually just kind of have that on their website. But it's a lot of work to get up to that point, and we want them to have the capacity to do that work and provide that option for people. And so, I mean, I think that's a long-term game, right? We have to defend what the IRS is doing as important work, which is, maybe a little bit difficult because people don't always think of the IRS as their favorite agency, but it's actually doing a lot of things that we think are really important this decade. And the other obvious one is we want them to be able to find tax cheats and make them pay their fair share. So we got a lot that we need to defend from them, and a lot of good things that they're doing.
I think I'm going to reject the premise of the question, because I feel like all tenants are ever doing is playing defense, and we're bleeding out, right? And there's a leader in our base who says you can't put a Band-Aid over a bullet wound. It just doesn't work. Like, it's not that we don't have time for defense, we don't, but it's like we can't just be playing defense. So I'm actually going to say, I think the way that we need to be campaigning is we need to know what our North Star is. For us, the North Star is a homes guarantee. We need a world that treats housing as a public good instead of a commodity. We need to guarantee housing as a public good for everyone. That is not the world we live in the year of our Lord 2023, right? So the way that we campaign has to be knowing that North Star, knowing where we are today, and then knowing what steps are going to take us towards that instead of the other direction. Because some shit sounds good, but it's taking us the wrong way, right? So the steps that we take today need to be headed in that direction. And I think on that front, there's a couple things I think about right now. Like, Congress isn't passing some big social housing bill tomorrow. And our leaders are like, we do not have time to keep losing, right? We can't do another message bill. I'm so sorry, and no offense to anyone who's working on beautiful social housing message bills, but my leaders won't let me do that, right? So they're like, what can we win that will make our lives materially better today? So we're focused on a couple things. One is at FHFA, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, there's a comment period that's open right now that asks the question, what can we be doing? What should we be doing in our role as the regulator of the GSEs to say if you're getting that money if you're getting federal financing, you're on the hook for a set of tenant protections. We want to see rent regulations as a part of those tenant protections. And even that, in the year of our Lord, 2023, is, people are looking at us like we're crazy. I was just on the Hill today, and they're like, the realtors have an office in every congressional district in this country. I'm not crossing them. And I'm like, your constituents don't have any place to live, So anyway, so that's one of the things that we're working on today that I wouldn't call a defensive fight, but it's like a fight in the world as it is, right? It's not like liberation once we win conditions on GSE lending. It is a really materially significant thing that would change millions of lives across the country. And then at the local level, we deal with this question all the time of like world as it is versus world as it should be. I just organized a building of Burmese refugees and Mexican immigrants who are facing a mass eviction when a New Jersey speculator bought their building. And for months, we were like, I don't know if there's a solution here. But the tenants were like, we won't go. We can't go, and we won't go. And I just want you all to think about what it means for tenants who have been paying $350 in rent in Kansas City when they're told that they're being evicted. If you're evicted from New York, if you're displaced from DC, you come to a place like Kansas City. If you get evicted in Kansas City, where do you go? Where do you go? For months, we lost sleep, plagued by this question, right? In the end, we cut a deal where the city came in and subsidized the rent at $450. The tenants are paying $400, and 8 families get to stay in their homes for 2 years. Again, this is not a story of liberation. The landlord gets paid. It's just 2 years, but that's 2 years of 8 families who get to stay in their homes, keep their jobs, their kids are going to the same school, and the most important piece is, in this world as it is fight, we've asked the city to start to question their role, right? What should the city be doing to actually intervene when a New Jersey speculator is kicking out 8 families who don't have any place to go? And they actually took a step that I think is the step towards our North Star. Today we get those 8 families secured. Tomorrow we win municipal social housing in Kansas City.
Jamila?
All right. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, some people say that the best defensive strategy is an offensive strategy. I would say that in order to play offense, you actually have to understand where your opposition is, what they're doing, and how they're moving. In healthcare right now, the issue that I'm most obsessed with at the moment is the fact that Medicare, the program that all of you said you knew someone on Medicare, the program that is probably the beacon of public provision, the public option for people who are aging, for people who are disabled, is being privatized at a rate that is dizzying. 2 weeks ago, we hit the point that 50% of who are on Medicare are on privatized Medicare plans, on Medicare Advantage plans, which the government is overpaying due to scams by the insurance companies by about $30 billion a year, and which, even if you took out that $30 billion a year, the companies are making tremendous profit off of. Medicare Advantage is perhaps the most profitable product for every one of the major 7 health insurance companies right now. They make at least double the profit they make on employer healthcare, double the profit that they make on individual healthcare plans. This is taxpayers' dollars, $400 billion of our money that the government is giving over to private corporations without the kind of regulation, without the kind of strings attached to actually protect patients. And I could go into all the effects that has for patients, because these companies are hell-bent on keeping as much of the money for themselves and not paying it out in actual care for patients. For me, the way we fight that is by improving Medicare. Instead of giving lots of money to private corporations, more than we give per person on Medicare, why don't we make it so that people could all choose Medicare, that could be a real choice that people make without fear for the financial ramifications of choosing Medicare versus a cheaper, on the surface, privatized Medicare plan. So the defense is offense, but for too long, for 25 years, this was happening. And so many of us in the healthcare space, and myself included, right, were not aware of what our opposition was doing. Now, the profits that they have made from this, from taxpayers, is being used to consolidate the healthcare industry. They have so much cash, they can buy up the AI firms and buy up the primary care doctors and buy up the hospitals and merge health insurance companies. And so on our watch, we have a much harder opponent to fight than we've ever had before. And so I think we do have to be thinking, I think like really key to organizing activism is situational awareness at all times. And I want to know where my enemy is. And so I'm keeping very close tabs on who's buying what in health insurance, on because we need to know where they're moving so that we can fight them in the future and secure the thing that we know we all need, which is a right to health care in good times and in bad.
Thank you. Okay, here's what we're gonna do. So I'm gonna take 3 questions, a minute or less, and then we'll do a speed round here of final thoughts, comments, and answers to the questions. So, I saw a hand there.
Hi there. Wow. Hi there. My name is Francisco Diaz. I work for the Center for Popular Democracy, and I really appreciate kind of trying to deal with the world as it is. And I'm just kind of reflecting on the defense question that you brought up, Dorian. And one observation we've seen in organizing around excluded worker funds, for example, is how navigation systems in places like New Jersey and New York helped build a new constituency to fight for a permanent version of those reforms. So we saw a quick expansion of public power and then a hollowing out very quickly where it was temporary. So I guess my question is kind of like, how do we deal with the world as it is, and what role does kind of active design of policies or fighting for policies that aren't just wins, but also actively support community, worker, and tenant organizings? And like, what ideas do you have that aren't just kind of establishing the right to organize, right? Not just union organizing for public projects or the right to organize tenant unions, for example.
Great question. That was 70 seconds. So I'm gonna find you. But great question. Let's go over here, please. Hi, Don Cohen. Yep.
This isn't a question, this is a comment. And it's
A minute or less.
okay. Market failure. I don't want to be a jerk, but I feel like a jerk saying this. When we say this is a market failure, we're embracing the idea that the market gets to decide first what to deliver. I think that there are things that are market things and there are things that are public things, and market is simply the wrong tool. But when we talk about market failure, we say, okay, well, the market didn't take care of it, so we'll have to take care of it. If you want to get everyone health care, if you want to get everyone housing, if you want to clean the air, the market, you can use market mechanisms, but it's the wrong tool to solve our problems.
So the question is, how do we not say market failure anymore? Thank you, Don.
Good job.
All right.
Thanks. This has been fantastic. Thanks so much. I'm so glad I came to this today. But we put universal health care, universal child care in our Restaurant Worker Bill of Rights because we see that as the only pathway towards a thriving wage, really, for low-wage workers in particular. What I want to know is, I didn't hear the word socialism at all in this conversation, and is that a conscious messaging decision, or is there something else going on there? Thank you.
All right, Teo, you see you bring in the Who wants to go first? On any of those. Questions or comments?
I'll go on the socialism thing. As an organizer, I find it, I think the most powerful way to speak about anything is about what material benefit, what material good it brings to people's lives. People don't know, like an ism never got me healthcare when I needed to go to the doctor, right? And I think it's really important, and I feel like I am, as someone who started in academia, and I have actively been retraining myself from even talking about neoliberalism or or socialism or whatever, but to actually talk about the material gain. People need to know that they have a guarantee to healthcare whenever they need it. Like when they're giving birth to their kid and it's a happy moment, and when they're at the end of their life or when they've had some sort of catastrophic illness, they need to know that they won't go broke. And I think we can describe our policy interventions in exactly those terms. And I think if we can't, then we need to do some more work and some more rigor about what those policy interventions are and how they will actually deliver for people.
I think kind of continuing on that line of thought, there's I think what people really want to see is institutions that exist and they know are going to be there to be able to meet different needs that they have. And one way I think about this, and kind of tying it back to the beginning of what is public capacity to deliver these things that people need. One way we think about it at Center for Public Enterprise is that we have tons of public institutions that exist all over the country. Of 3,300 public housing authorities all over the United States that mostly aren't doing all that much these days anymore. We also have public utilities and power authorities and economic development corporations, all these various kinds of public institutions that we really should be thinking about how do we utilize these existing public institutions to deliver this kind of stuff that we want, because they already exist. They have statutory authority. They can borrow. They can do all these things. How do we make use of them? And turn them back into these kind of trusted things that people can look to deliver the outcomes that they want in their life, that give them a stable, healthy, starting point to live their life.
Yeah, I think on socialism, in addition to what Jamila said, I can't knock a door and talk to someone about socialism. I can knock a door and talk to them about whether or not they can pay their bills and the kind of life they want their kid to live. And then in a tenant meeting in a couple weeks, we can talk about socialism. But it's that's never where we start, and that is a conscious choice. One thing that I think is kind of funny too is every solution we propose is socialistic, right? It's it is totally in that vein. And policymakers will often be like, well, do you have an example? Has anyone ever done social housing anywhere? And I'm like, have you heard of Vienna? It's been a very successful project for 100 years. And they're like, yeah, but do you have a different example? Because then they look and there's a building that says Karl Marx really big, right? So it's some of it, yes, is strategic because we're up against some pretty deep stigma in this country, but it's not like we're hiding from what we are trying to achieve, which is a much, much bigger role for the state in caring for people, period. You can call that whatever you want to, but that's what we're that's what we're looking for. And I will take your feedback about market failure. We should talk about it over drinks.
Dorian, can I say one more quick thing, which is on the socialism piece, we are up against something big in this country. I did not grow up in the United States. I grew up in Barbados, where we have public options for lots of things like childcare and healthcare and higher education, free university education, etc. And so right there with all the folks who want all of that, and yet we're up against, in a narrative sense, real opposition to that, even if people agree with the descriptive elements of what we're talking about. And so I think we do have to think consciously about how do we actually shore up the idea of public provision and public power and actually socialize that idea and have it be something that people understand and value, and that shifts the kind of support for some of these proposals in the long run. And I think part of how we do that is by actually holding up the beacons of public power and provision that we do have, the things that people do really love, that are examples of socialist policy or social, like Medicare, like national parks, like public libraries, et cetera, and make sure that those things are strong and that we continue to be able to treasure them for a long time.
So I want to close by just sharing something I just learned from each of you in this conversation. And I wish we had much more time. Paul, you taught me that we should actually learn to love the IRS. And it needs a little rebranding, but it's actually a very important public institution that makes possible all the things we want to actually do. I'll come back. I'll leave you for last. Jamila, I learned that we should always be mindful of understanding our opposition and be a bit sober about that with a power analysis and, yes, a freaking strategy to either demobilize or inoculate the opposition to our ideas. We always have had opposition to anything public-related or socialist-related or whatever the thing is. And then, Tara, for you, I really appreciate the pushback on the premise of the question and the ability to, even though we didn't have time to debate it, but you're going to go debate socialism and market failure at the bar, overlooking the Treasury Department in a few minutes. So I just appreciate your willingness to mix it up and to reject the premise of the question, because sharpening our tools with each other is actually really important. So with that, please join me in thanking our dope panelists. And as I look at the Groundwork team, I want to actually give a special thank you to the Groundwork Collaborative and for another great EconCon that will continue with drinks now, I believe, although we're going to hear from the voice of God in a second, I'm sure. And we'll see you all tomorrow.
Thank you all for attending the first day of EconCon 2023. We look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow for day 2. To conclude our evening, please feel free to make your way to View to enjoy some refreshments.